April 19th, 1987. Sespe Wilderness, Los Padres National Forest, California. A biologist crouches in chaparral with a radio receiver pressed to his ear. He has been tracking this bird for weeks. It has a wingspread of 9.5 feet, a face the color of old brick, and it knows the canyon thermals here the way most animals know water. They call it AC9, Adult Condor 9. It is the last wild California condor on Earth. The trap fires. The bird is taken, bagged, banded, and driven south to the San Diego Wild Animal Park. That was April 19th, 1987. The total California condor population on Earth stood at 27 birds. Every last one of them behind a fence. That was 1987. 38 years later, I watched a condor ride the canyon wind above the south rim, and I still don't quite believe either thing. It was the mid-1800s, and condors ranged from British Columbia to Baja California. They rode thermals above every major mountain range on the Pacific coast. They appear in the journals of Lewis and Clark. Indigenous people along the coast had names for them that stretched back further than any written record. They were enormous and, frankly, ugly, and they cleaned the land. Scavengers, carrion birds. A condor can spot a carcass from a mile up and reach it in minutes. They kept the ground clean of things that would otherwise rot and spread disease. The land used them, and for a long time they were everywhere the land was. Then the land changed around them, and they didn't change with it. Their range began contracting in the late 1800s. Feathers taken for hats, eggs collected for museum cases, shot for sport, or for the simpler reason that something that big and strange-looking made people uneasy. They can't outrun a rifle, and they don't know enough to try. Then the 20th century arrived with more specific tools. DDT, thinning the shells of eggs that never hatched. Lead poisoning from rifle rounds left in gut piles. Condors eat carrion, and spent ammunition came with the carcass. Power lines. Loss of open foraging country as the West developed. By 1940, condors were gone from Oregon. By 1950, gone from the Pacific coast of Baja California. Each decade took another piece of range. In 1982, a census put the total wild population at 22 birds. 22 birds. Across the entire remaining range of a species that once stretched from British Columbia to Baja California. The whole species, reduced to 22 animals. The argument that followed was genuine, and it was hard. Ornithologists, wildlife managers, and conservationists came down on both sides of it with real conviction. One camp said, capture the remaining birds, bring them into zoos, start a captive breeding program, and release the offspring once the numbers were strong enough and the threats could be managed. The other camp said no. Carl Koford had spent more time studying condors in the field than almost anyone alive. He believed capture would stress the birds fatally. He believed the captive program would fail. He believed it was better to let the species end in the wild on its own terms than to put the last survivors behind glass and call it conservation. Koford had serious standing. People with decades of fieldwork agreed with him. The debate was genuine. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sided with capture. Starting in 1982, teams began trapping the wild birds one by one. It was slow, careful, contested work. Each bird required weeks of radio tracking, a specific trap site, specific bait, specific conditions. You don't simply walk up to a 9-foot wingspan carrion bird and take it. You earn every one. If the program had stalled after the first few captures, if funding had dried up, if a political fight in Washington had shut it down mid-course, this would be a very different story. But it didn't stall. The numbers in captivity climbed as the numbers in the wild fell. By early 1987, there was one bird left outside a cage. AC9. A male, older, range-worn. Biologists had been watching him for months. On April 19, 1987, they made the call and set the trap. 27 condors in captivity, 0 in the wild. Read that again. The species that had ranged across the entire Pacific slope of North America was now contained in 2 zoo facilities, the San Diego Wild Animal Park and the Los Angeles Zoo. The largest land bird on the continent had a total wild habitat of 0 acres. If you had told anyone in 1975 that it would come to this, they would have told you it was already over. What happened inside those enclosures is worth slowing down for. The breeding program used hand puppets shaped like adult condors to feed the chicks. Handlers wore condor head gloves and never let the young birds see a human face. The goal was to raise condors that would behave like condors, not like animals that had learned to associate humans with food. Pay attention to that detail. A bird that imprints on humans cannot survive release. It approaches people. It loses its fear of roads and power lines. It comes to campsites looking for a handout. You end up with a bird that is alive in body and gone in instinct. The puppet program was the difference between birds that would eventually soar and birds that would need to be brought back in. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. The first captive bred chick to survive to maturity hatched in 1988. Then more. By 1991, the captive population had grown to 52 birds. Still all in enclosures, still all dependent on human management, but the number was moving in the right direction for the first time in decades. The biologists running the program would look back on 1991 and say that was when they first believed it might actually work. Before that, they were operating on conviction more than confidence. January 14, 1992. 2 condors, both captive bred, were released at the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, the same mountains where AC9 had been trapped 5 years earlier. They flew. I could dress that up, but it doesn't need it. They flew. They found the thermals and they used them. They did what condors are built to do, and nobody had been certain they would until they did. Everything the critics had said about captive birds being unable to return to the wild was about to be tested, 1 bird, 1 season, 1 year at a time. The releases continued. More birds, more locations. The Grand Canyon in 1996. Big Sur, California in 1997, a stretch of coast where condors hadn't been seen in decades. Baja California in 2002. Each release was monitored and tracked. Birds died. Some were struck by power lines. Some were shot, illegally. Some simply disappeared and were never recovered. And then, the program's worst problem made itself impossible to ignore. The birds kept dying of lead poisoning. Researchers who had been tracking blood lead levels from the beginning kept raising the same flag. The releases were working, but the lead was undoing them. The condors were eating carcasses left by hunters. The spent ammunition came with the meat. The same thing that had helped push the species off a cliff in the first place was waiting for every bird that came back. The timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. California passed legislation in 2007 requiring hunters to use non-lead ammunition in condor range. Arizona followed with its own program. It was not a complete fix. It was the beginning of one. The blood monitoring continued. Birds with dangerously elevated lead levels were trapped, treated, and re-released. The program did not end with the first release in 1992 and declare victory. It became permanent infrastructure. Annual captures, blood draws, medication, re-release, year after year after year. That part does not often get told in the short version. The recovery required not just releasing birds back into the wild. It required changing what hunters put into the ground. It required years of scientific documentation, policy negotiation, and cooperation from hunting communities that didn't always see the point immediately. In some places, that cooperation came readily. In others, it was a grind. While the lead fight was grinding forward, the condors were doing something that no one had projected with certainty. They were breeding in the wild. The first wild-hatched condor chick in Arizona was confirmed in 2001. In California, 2003. After 16 years of releases, of birds raised in zoos on condor puppet gloves learning to be wild, the species was producing the next generation on its own. 16 years. And then a chick in a cliff nest in the Vermilion Cliffs of Arizona. The first wild birth in a region that had been empty of condors for a century. Think about what that means for the birds there from the beginning. The condors released in 1992 were parents by the early 2000s. Their offspring were released. Some of those offspring have since bred. The wild population now includes multiple generations of birds that have never been inside a cage. By the early 2000s, the recovery had weight behind it. In 1992, there was conviction. By 2001, cautious hope. By 2010, something that looked like momentum. A species rebuilding what the land had lost. The range expanded as the population grew. Incrementally, steadily, year by year. Condors reappeared over coastal ranges in central California. They began showing up in Utah. Pacific coast birds moved into habitat that had been empty for generations. The Grand Canyon flock became what it is now, resident, established, visible from the rim without binoculars. They use the south rim thermals in the late morning when the canyon heats and the air begins to lift. You can stand at the overlook and watch them circle without any gear at all. I did, a few years after I retired. No uniform, no radio receiver, just an older man at the rim in early April when the thermals are already building by 10 in the morning. There were 4 or 5 condors working the same column of warm air. Circling without apparent effort, those enormous wings held flat and still. One of them broke off from the thermal and moved south, crossing the canyon without a single wing beat. Just riding the warm air coming up off the Tonto Plateau, dropping in slow arcs toward the canyon floor, and then it was below the rim and gone. I stood there for a while after that. 34 years of watching this country try to heal itself. Some things still catch you off guard. The numbers as of the most recent count, more than 540 California condors total. More than 300 of them free flying. The range runs from central California through Arizona, Utah, and into Baja California, Mexico. Pacific coast birds have returned to Big Sur. There are condors soaring over terrain that had not felt those wing beats in living memory. In 1987, 27 birds, all in cages. By 2024, more than 500, and the number still climbing. I would have bet against it. That last wild condor was pulled from the sky in 1987 because 27 birds was not enough to survive what was killing them. The sky they fly now is the same sky. What changed was the lead, partially, in the places where the ammunition restrictions held. and the monitoring, and the ongoing annual work that keeps the population moving forward. Because this is the part of the story that does not wrap up cleanly. The condor is not saved. It is being saved, present tense. The recovery still requires active management every year. Blood draws, treatment, tracking tags on released birds. Management decisions made by people who spend their careers watching these animals. The bison recovery and the beaver parachute drop work differently. Once those animals are back in functioning habitat, the land carries most of the load. The condor recovery demands more. It requires the lead to keep coming out of the environment, and that process is incomplete. That is the accurate version. The condor came back from 27 birds in 2 zoo enclosures to more than 500 flying free. That happened. The full weight of it is worth standing with. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. What I know about the condor is this. Sometimes the only path back to the wild runs through a cage. Sometimes you have to catch every last one to save any of them. That condor that dropped below the south rim and disappeared into the canyon shadow. It came back up. I could see it working a thermal a quarter-mile east, gaining altitude, moving away from me until I lost it against the sky. Condors don't need you to watch. They were riding those thermals before any of us were here, and with some sustained attention and some continued luck, they'll still be there when we're gone. If this is the kind of story you come here for, I'd be glad to have you subscribe. There are more of these. Places that came back, animals that came back, ground that wasn't supposed to recover and did. And I'd like to know, is there a place near you that came back? Something you watched recover? Leave it in the comments. I read them.